Hello there! I'm glad you made it. I'm Hyperdulia and welcome back to the channel. This is where I read books of the Bible and report back on what they're about, some things people often miss, and whether you should read them too. I'm going to keep this intro kind of short. This is day 3 of Pentateuch week. I assume you've seen the Genesis and Exodus videos. If not, you don't have to, but I recommend that you do. It kind of helps contextualize them, and I'll put their links in the description of this video. But otherwise, let's get on with the show. Today we will be talking about Leviticus. So Leviticus is also known as Vayikra, or And the Lord Summoned in Hebrew, which, sorry if I butchered that pronunciation, but it is the third book in the Bible and the Torah. It's called Leviticus, emphasis on the Levi, because it's mainly concerned with the worship practices of Moses' brother Aaron and his descendants, who belong to the Israelite tribe known as Levi, after one of the sons of Israel. The Levites, and especially Aaron and his children, are most associated with acting as priests and conducting religious ceremony and ritual on behalf of the community. Aaron is an interesting but controversial character. He does some things that are a little bit questionable throughout the text. He does help create the golden calf, but regardless, he's still very important to the development of this community, and Leviticus focuses on his and his descendants' contributions to the worship practice of early Israelite society. So we're still in the Pentateuch. We've talked about the documentary hypothesis before, which is the JEDP theory of authorship, and that's still definitely in play when it comes to the authorship of Leviticus. But this book is a little bit simpler than some of the other texts we've looked at. There are 2 main players this time instead of 4 or more. There's the priestly author, or P, who we all remember from Genesis and Exodus, but there's also a new author, H, which stands for holiness, due to the writer's insistence upon Israelites remaining holy and acting in a holy way. And the distinctiveness of these 2 styles means it's actually pretty easy to figure out who wrote what. P takes over most of chapters 1 through 16, where they talk about methods of sacrifice, the dedication of the tabernacle, Aaron's sons getting murked by God out of nowhere, and the interesting stuff, ritual purity. Meanwhile, H takes on chapters 17 through 26 in what's referred to as the Holiness Code, which pertains to further law-giving, but with a notable difference in ideology from P. The priestly author is obviously a little bit biased towards priests, and describes them as the only Israelites that can be considered holy, and focuses on their ritual purity during worship. In a lot of ways, this section is tailored exclusively for priests, and not necessarily the common rabble. Meanwhile, H offers a code of rules which, if followed, makes it possible for lay Israelites to be considered holy as well, and is generally a lot more concerned with the ethics and morals of the larger community. This can be explained in part by the fact that the Holiness Code seems to have been written after the priestly sections of Leviticus as a sort of amendment. This probably happened after the exile to Babylon and the destruction of the first temple of Jerusalem in 586 BCE. Therefore, Leviticus was written across a significant period of time, and its laws need to be understood as occurring across different contexts. They have been edited and redacted and sometimes even contradicted as the needs of the society have shifted over time and the power of influence has bounced back between different traditions. While it is collaborative, P and H are clearly writing for different purposes. Where P may be primarily concerned with ritual correctness among the priestly class, H is especially interested in reclaiming some of this holiness for the larger community that may be considered to have been lost with the destruction of the temple and the exile to Babylon. Just something to keep in mind. As for narrative, Leviticus it's not especially notable. It describes the chronological period immediately following the construction of the tabernacle, and it occurs on Mount Sinai exclusively, and primarily consists of God telling Moses, "Can you please tell the Israelites that this is how I want them to perform this particular ritual?" In later chapters, it shifts from how to perform this particular ritual more towards, "Can you please tell the Israelites to not do this particular thing?" Most of the narrative movement comes from the priestly chapters of 1 through 16, but it's primarily just there to facilitate the law-giving process. There are some interesting sections which can reasonably be called story. Most notable for me is when 2 of Aaron's sons, Nadab and Abihu, slip up and perform an incense offering, not asked for which they are repaid by, quote, fire coming out from the presence of the Lord and consuming them. which may seem initially like an overreaction, but you gotta understand the incense smelled like patchouli, so it's actually totally justified. There is the odd story meant to drive home a particular moral, like that of Aaron's sons, or the story of the guy that gets stoned for blaspheming in Leviticus 24:10-23, but otherwise this chapter is fairly static in terms of narrative, and it serves the primary function instead of laying the foundation of many religious practices that are still practiced by many today. This includes things that we commonly associate with Jewish traditions, like dietary restrictions and the calendar of religious holidays. It provides ethical context for the rest of the quest for the Promised Land in the early Tanakh, and it's kind of like sitting in your car finalizing a grocery list before actually embarking on your zany grocery store adventure. You're sitting in one place, it's important, and it provides context to your trip, and it comes before you start going to wherever they keep the milk and honey. No, it's not a perfect metaphor, but I'm not getting paid here, you know. All that said, there are plenty of interesting things to talk about in Leviticus, the first of which has to do with everyone's favorite subject. That's right, folks, we're finally going to talk about leprous houses. This is one of those minor oddities that's easy to scan and think, that's weird, before moving right along. But I'd love to stay here for a second because it has some pretty interesting implications. Essentially, the priestly chapters of 13.1 through 14.57 concern leprosy, or more accurately translated, surface afflictions, in three categories: people, which makes sense, and then cloth and houses. And it describes what to do if any of these people or objects contract leprosy. The term leprosy was kind of a general term used for skin diseases, which were associated with ritual impurity, which make it challenging for a person with the affliction to participate in social life. There is a ritual sacrifice described meant to alleviate the symptoms, but if they remained, the person ended up rejected from the community for the sake of broader ritual purity. And interestingly, the same was done with houses. They were scraped, inspected by priests, abandoned by owners, and then if the disease in the walls persisted, they were demolished for the sake of, you guessed it, ritual purity. A similar procedure was followed when it came to cloth items. Now, by house leprosy, they're probably just referring to mold and mildew and that sort of thing, maybe fungus. But I think it's so interesting that the parallel was drawn between humans and objects with surface afflictions in the first place. And they're treated in the same way, by cleansing, crossing your fingers, and finally excommunicating them if all else fails. In my opinion, similar to the tabernacle being a physical dwelling place of God, this is an example of the importance applied to the physical world as more than just a means to an end. It's leagues away from this fleshly world of dust that distracts from the more noble religious pursuits that at least a lot of people commonly associate with Abrahamic religions. The world is alive, and it's breathing, and it's sometimes, unfortunately, leprous. And I think that attitude is pretty interesting to catch. And if you think that's a bit of a reach, then I just hope you think that this passage is as sick as I think it is. Quote, "When you come into the land of Canaan, which I give you for a possession, and I put a leprous disease in a house in the land of your possession, the owner of the house shall come and tell the priest, saying, quote, there seems to be some sort of disease in my house." You can't tell me that's not a top 10 God quote right there. Put it in the Hall of Fame right next to "You shall not murder." Don't at me. Moving right along, and speaking of famous God quotes, let's talk tattoos. You may know this next excerpt from it being your horrible great aunt's favorite Bible verse. Quote, "You shall not make any gashes in your flesh for the dead, or tattoo any marks upon you." Basically, it's God saying, you know that's on your body forever, right? And it might seem kind of random. It's easy for this to fly under the radar when it's accompanied by other verses like, "You shall not round off the hair on your temples," and "You shall not sow your field with two kinds of seed." But this is another one of those stray verses that just happens to get weaponized a lot in today's world. So let's look at where it actually comes from, and okay, yep, I googled it for literally 1 second, and it turns out ancient Egyptians tattooed and branded slaves with the names of gods to denote servitude to the pharaoh. Therefore, tattoos were avoided because they were marks of servitude, and often ones that proclaimed devotion to a different god, which, regardless of who you ask, violates one of the Decalogue's commandments on idolatry and alternative deities. To drive the point home, there's another line in a later book, Isaiah, that seems to describe getting a tattoo to celebrate devotion to God in a positive light. Quote, "Another descendant will write on the hand the Lord's and adopt the name of Israel." So the next time you're ambushed at a family gathering for a word tattooed that you're like solidly 80% sure the meaning of, tell them it's actually fine because people can't be enslaved anymore. Or at least someone needs to tell Elon Musk and his dad they're not supposed to. And the last subject I want to cover has to do with class and the ritual offerings at the very beginning of Leviticus, in chapters 1.1 through 7.38. There are a lot of different types of offerings you can make to God. Among them, a well-being offering to give thanks, or a purification offering to remove impurities from a person or place, a reparation or guilt offering to let God know you're really sorry for coveting your neighbor's ox or something of the sort. Instructions for performing these offerings are gruesome and far from lax, so quick trigger warning if you don't like killing animals, I guess. The purification offering, for example, asks that a priest slaughters a bull at the entrance of the tent of meeting, sprinkles blood 7 times in front of the sanctuary curtain, puts blood on and around the incense altar, removes the organs of the bull to burn at the altar, and then skin the bull and burn that and what's left of the carcass in a separate fire outside the city. Frankly excessive. But what I found interesting here is that they have a sort of tiered sacrificial system based on what you can afford. In Leviticus 1 and 2, there are instructions for burnt offerings if the animal is, quote, from the herd like a bull, or a little smaller and from the flock like a sheep or a goat, or a little smaller still in the form of a turtle dove or a pigeon. If you can't get your hands on even a small animal to sacrifice, there are extensive instructions for both raw and cooked grain offerings, some of which don't even call for frankincense in order to make it more affordable to the lower class. It's fascinating how, despite the extensive instructions for how to get it right, never mind the entire rest of Leviticus telling you that you're probably ritually impure and that there's dire consequences for messing up, the writers of this book have clearly gone to lengths in order to not exclude the lower classes from these ritual practices. And this is coming from the priestly author, who, if you remember, doesn't feel that lay Israelites can even be considered holy, so this is extra surprising. And it makes me wonder if these laws were original to the community traditions, or whether they arose over time as issues came up of poor people being gatekept from religious practice. If you know the answer to this, please let me know, I'm super interested. But regardless, I think the inclusion of these alternative sacrificial options is very, very cool. Okay, it's time for the final review. I will say, this is an extremely important text in the canon of Jewish religious law. And besides Deuteronomy, this is the first place I'd go if that sort of thing interests you. However, Leviticus is an extremely technical work, and it spends a lot of time on details. This is a manual for how to properly engage in rituals like sacrifice and religious holidays, which is interesting and obviously very important to the faith, but as someone who doesn't identify that way, I have to say I don't feel that this was essential reading for me. Even the intro to Leviticus in my Bible says that the book is most profitably read first according to legal topic rather than from beginning to end. Is the content in Leviticus interesting? Absolutely yes. There are plenty of passages like those describing the Jubilee years, for example, where slaves are released, agricultural work is stopped, and ancestral lands are returned to the original owners, or how it's not okay to get down and dirty on your period, that are really interesting. But if you're mostly interested in the secret tea that your youth group leader won't spill for you, you may not find it here. If you have read Leviticus and disagree with my verdict, or have anything that I missed that you'd like to share, please sound off below. I love to learn. Otherwise, that's a wrap. Hyperdulia signing off. Until next time, see you tomorrow for numbers. I got more than 50 shades of green, living in a house of blue. What the hell do you mean you forgot the milk and honey? It's literally the only thing on the shopping list. Okay, thank you.